The last painting sold for $340,000. He had listed it for $80. I know this because I was standing outside on the sidewalk on a Tuesday night in October in flat shoes and a coat I'd had since 2019, listening through the tall glass doors as the auctioneer called the final number and the room applauded. I didn't go in. I didn't need to. Every person holding a paddle in that room had called me before they arrived. Dominic thought he was selling my work to strangers. He had no idea he was selling it back to me. Before we go any further, what time is it where you are right now? Drop your time and your country in the comments. I want to know who's up with me tonight. The first thing you need to understand about Dominic Hale is that he was the kind of man who made you feel like the most important person in a room full of important people. That was his gift. And for 9 years, I mistook it for love. We met at a fundraiser for the Woodruff Arts Center in the spring of 2015. I was 30 years old, newly returned to Atlanta after 4 years in Paris, and I was standing in the corner of a reception hall, holding a glass of sparkling water I hadn't touched, watching a couple argue quietly near the coat check. Dominic appeared at my elbow without introduction and said, "They've been doing that for 20 minutes. I give it 6 more before one of them pretends to get a phone call." He was right. It took 4. He was 43 now. Back then, he was 36 and running a mid-size commercial real estate firm out of a glass office in Buckhead that had his last name on the door. Dominic Hale Properties. He wore it like a second skin, that name. Like it explained everything you needed to know about him. I was Valentina Webb. Though most people in the art world knew me only as VNL, the anonymous curatorial voice behind a small but increasingly respected private collection. I had started it with $40,000 I saved working as a translator in Lyon, buying works from emerging black artists before anyone else thought to look. By 2015, VNL Private had a mailing list of 63 collectors across 8 countries. I had never put my face to it. That was intentional. Dominic knew I was an artist. He did not know what else I was. I kept those 2 things in separate rooms inside myself, and I was careful about which doors I left open. We dated for 14 months before he proposed. I said yes on a rainy Sunday morning in our kitchen before either of us had coffee, which I think now says something about the kind of certainty I felt. We married in a small ceremony at a friend's property outside to cater 31 guests. No photographer, just a man with a good camera and an understanding of light. I wore my grandmother's earrings. Dominic cried at the altar, which surprised me and moved me in equal measure. The years that followed were not unhappy. I want to be honest about that. There were good seasons, long weekends in Savannah, the winter we spent 3 weeks in Portugal, because a flight got canceled, and we decided to simply stay the way he used to leave the light on over the stove when I worked late in the studio, so I could find my way through the dark apartment without waking him. Small things. The architecture of a life built between 2 people who genuinely, for a long time, chose each other. My studio occupied the 2nd bedroom of our penthouse on Peachtree Road. Floor-to-ceiling shelves of reference books, a northeast-facing window that gave the best light between 7 and 11 in the morning, the smell of linseed oil permanently embedded in the baseboards. I painted large canvases that required me to stand back 6 feet to see the whole of them. Abstracts mostly, though the people who knew my work said they saw faces in them. I never confirmed or denied. The paintings accumulated. Some I sold through a dealer friend in Brooklyn under a different name. Most I kept. The studio became a kind of archive. 14 works over 7 years, each one a record of a particular internal season I had moved through and survived. Dominic would sometimes stand in the doorway and look at them the way people look at things they find beautiful but cannot parse. He called them Valentina's universe. He never asked what they meant. I did not think that was a problem. Some things between 2 people should remain private. I believed that then. I believe it differently now. V&L Private grew quietly and steadily in those years. By 2021, we had facilitated the private sale of over $4 million in emerging black art. I had 2 full-time staff, Marcus Webb, my operations director, and the person I trusted most in any room, and a young woman named Denise, who handled logistics and correspondence. None of this appeared in any publication. None of it was attached to my face or my married name. It existed in a separate register of my life. And I kept it there because I had learned early that women who build things quietly tend to keep them longer. Dominic knew I did consulting for art collectors. He never pressed for details. I told myself this was because he respected my privacy. Looking back, I think it was because he never found it interesting enough to ask. That is the thing about being underestimated by someone who loves you. It does not announce itself. It settles in slowly the way water finds the lowest point in a room. You do not notice it until you are already standing in it. The first sign came on a Thursday in February, 3 months before everything fell apart. I remember it was Thursday because I had a call with a collector in Nairobi at 7 in the morning, and I was already at my desk when Dominic left for work. He kissed the top of my head. His cologne was different. Not wrong, just different. A degree off from the version of him I knew, I noticed. I filed it and said nothing. That was the last ordinary morning we had. I have always been a noticer. It is not something I cultivated deliberately. It came from childhood, growing up in a house where the atmosphere could shift without warning, where reading the room was a survival skill before it was a personality trait. My mother used to say I was born with my eyes already open. She meant it as a compliment. I took it as a description, so when things began to change with Dominic, I did not miss it. I simply did not yet understand what I was seeing. It started small. Everything does. The cologne was the first thing, but I have already told you that. The second thing was the gym bag. Dominic had been a consistent early morning runner for the 11 years I had known him. 6:30 out the door, back by 7:45, shoes left on the mat by the elevator. In March, the shoes stopped appearing on the mat. He was still leaving at 6:30. He was not coming back until after 9. I did not ask where he was running. I watched the pattern, and I waited for more data. The third thing was the phone. Not that he was on it. Maury had always been a man who moved through life with a phone in his hand, the particular restlessness of someone who needed to feel reachable at all times. What changed was what he did when it rang in my presence, before he would answer or ignore it without ceremony. Now there was a half-second pause before he picked up a small recalibration, barely visible, the kind of thing you would miss if you were not paying the specific quality of attention I was paying. He would glance at the screen, then glance at me, then answer in the hallway. I noted it. I said nothing. The fourth thing was the money. Not large amounts. Dominic was not careless enough for that. Small transfers, the kind that disappear inside the ordinary noise of a household's finances. $800 to an account I didn't recognize in late March. $1,200 in April, same account, different date. I found them the way I find most things, by accident, while I was looking for something else. I had been searching our joint account for a charge from a framing supply company in Decatur, and there they were, sitting in the transaction history like they belonged. I wrote down the account number on a Post-it and put it in the inside pocket of my winter coat. Then I went back to looking for the framing charge. The fifth thing was the one that named it. On the second Tuesday of April, I found a parking receipt in the pocket of Dominic's dry cleaning before I brought it to the building's package room. I have a habit trained into me by years of managing other people's logistics, of checking pockets before anything goes anywhere. It is automatic. I do not think about it. The receipt was from a surface lot on Ponce de Leon Avenue, 3 blocks from Ponce City Market. Timestamp 11:47 p.m., a Tuesday. Dominic had told me that Tuesday he was at a dinner with a developer from Charlotte that had run long. He had texted me at 9:30 to say he was heading home. He did not arrive until after 1 in the morning. I had been asleep. I did not hear him come in. The lot on Ponce de Leon was not on any route between Buckhead and Charlotte. It was not on any route between Buckhead and anywhere Dominic had reason to be at 11:47 on a Tuesday night. I stood in our hallway with the receipt in my hand for what felt like a long time. The apartment was quiet. Through the studio door, I could see the edge of the largest canvas, a piece I had been working on for 4 months, deep burgundy and black, with a single horizontal line of ochre running through the center. I had not yet named it. I put the receipt in my coat pocket with the post-it. Then I went into the studio and worked until 4 in the morning. I did not cry. I want to be clear about that. What I felt was not the wet, collapsing grief of betrayal, not yet. What I felt was something colder and more precise. The sensation of a lock clicking open. The particular clarity that arrives when a pattern you have been half-reading suddenly resolves into a complete image. I knew what I was looking at. I had known for weeks in the way you know things before you're willing to name them. I finished the ochre line. I stepped back 6 feet and looked at the canvas. Then I went to bed. There is a specific kind of discipline required to continue living normally inside a house where you have just understood something that will eventually destroy everything. I did not know then how long I would need to sustain it. As it turned out, it was 6 more weeks. 6 weeks of shared dinners and Sunday mornings and the ordinary physical proximity of 2 people who still slept in the same bed. I was good at it. That surprised me, and then it didn't. Because here is what I understood that Dominic never did. I had been trained my whole life to feel things fully and show them strategically. He had always assumed my stillness was passivity. He did not know it was preparation. In the 3rd week of April, I called Marcus, not to tell him about Dominic, not yet. I called to ask him a procedural question about VNL's ownership documentation, specifically about how our acquisition records were structured and whose name appeared on what. The call took 11 minutes. By the end of it, I had the answer to a question I hadn't fully known I was asking. What I found in those records would matter later, more than I anticipated. But before any of that, before the documents and the phone calls and the Tuesday night in October when I stood on the sidewalk outside a room full of people who worked for me, I had to come home one afternoon in May and find the studio empty. 14 canvases, gone. In their place on the floor where the largest one had leaned against the north wall, a single sheet of paper in Dominic's handwriting. In storage. Will explain. He never explained. I stood in the doorway of the studio for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. I know the exact duration because my phone was in my hand when I walked in, and I had just started a voice memo to remind myself to order more cold-pressed linseed oil. The memo was still running. When I listened back to it later that night, what I heard was 4 minutes and 11 seconds of silence, and then the sound of me setting my keys down very carefully on the shelf by the door. That sound, the deliberate placement of keys, the refusal to let them drop, tells you everything about what I decided in those 4 minutes. I did not call Dominic. I did not call anyone. I walked the perimeter of the empty studio the way you walk a room after a fire, cataloging what was gone. The large burgundy canvas with the ochre line. The triptych I made the winter my mother had her surgery. The small square piece in cadmium yellow that I had always privately considered the best thing I had ever made. 14 works in total. I knew each one by its position on the wall, by the particular quality of light it held, by the internal season it had come from. All of it gone. The note was on the floor where the burgundy canvas had leaned. I picked it up. Dominic's handwriting, the tall, slightly backward slant of a left-handed man who had been made to write with his right. In storage, will explain. No date, no signature. As if the absence of those things made it less of a decision. I folded the note in half and put it in my jacket pocket. Then I went to his office. Dominic's home office was at the far end of our hallway, a room I entered perhaps 4 times a year, always by invitation, always briefly. He kept it locked when he was not in it. I had a key because I had insisted on one since early in our marriage, citing fire safety with the kind of calm reasonableness that left no room for argument. He had given it to me and forgotten he had. I unlocked the door. I went to his desk. I opened the top right drawer first, the one he always reached for reflexively in the way right-handed people always go to the same place, and found nothing unusual. Pens, a spare charging cable, a takeout menu from a Thai restaurant on Northside Drive that had closed in 2021. The second drawer held files. I went through them with the methodical patience of someone who has spent years reviewing acquisition documents for errors. I was not looking for anything specific. I was looking for the thing that would explain what was missing from my studio. I found it in the third folder from the front. A contract. 4 pages printed on plain white paper, folded once. The header read, Harmon and Associates Private Auction Services, Atlanta, Georgia. Below that, a consignment agreement for 14 works of visual art, listed by dimensions and medium, each one described in terms so generic they could have been any paintings by anyone. Mixed media on canvas 60x 72 inches. Oil and acrylic on canvas 48x 48 inches. No titles, no artist name in the body of the document. On the signature line at the bottom of page 1, Dominic Aurelius Hale. Signed in the backward slant I knew as well as my own handwriting. On the line marked owner/artist, consent blank. I read the contract twice. Then I read it a third time slowly, the way you read something you want to be certain you are understanding correctly, and not just seeing what you expect to see. The auction was scheduled for the 3rd Tuesday of October. The location, a converted warehouse space on Mean Street in Midtown that Harmon and Associates leased for private events. Estimated value listed per work $75,000 to $95,000. Total estimated proceeds just over $1 million. I sat in Dominic's chair for a moment. Through the window behind his desk, I could see the building across the street, the late afternoon light catching the upper floors in a way that made the glass look like hammered copper. I thought about the parking receipt on Ponce de Leon. I thought about the $800 transfer and the $1 transfer and the account number on the post-it in my coat pocket. I thought about the apartment I did not yet know about, the one on the 18th floor in Midtown, with a view I would not learn about until later. And I thought about Sienna, whose name I did not yet know who was at that moment, in a life I could not yet see, waiting for a man who had just sold his wife's soul to finance her rent. I did not feel what I expected to feel. What I felt was a door opening. I photographed every page of the contract with my phone. I replaced it in the folder in the drawer in the exact position I had found it. I relocked the office. I went to the kitchen and made a cup of tea. Earl Grey, 2 minutes, no sugar, and I sat at the kitchen island. And I thought, with the particular quality of focus I reserve for problems that require solutions rather than reactions. By the time the tea was finished, I had the outline of a plan. I called Marcus at 6:47 that evening. He answered on the second ring, which he always did, which was one of the reasons I trusted him with everything that mattered. I need you to pull the full buyer registry from our last 3 invitation-only events, I said. Everyone who attended, everyone who bid, everyone who was invited and declined. I need it by tomorrow morning. Is everything all right? Marcus asked. Pull the registry, I said. I'll explain tomorrow. He pulled it. By the time we spoke the next morning, I had cross-referenced the list against the contract I had photographed, against the estimated sale price of each work, against the seating capacity of the Mean Street space, as listed on Harmon and Associates' website. The numbers resolved cleanly into a single conclusion. If I could get enough VNL buyers into that room, I could control every paddle. Not some of them, all of them. The auction was in 6 months. I had 6 months to do what I'd always done, build something invisible in plain sight that no one saw coming. Dominic came home at 8:15 that evening. He kissed my cheek. He smelled of the different cologne. We ate dinner at the kitchen island, leftover roasted chicken, a salad. I had made a glass of red wine each. He talked about a development deal in Gwinnett County. I listened. I asked one follow-up question about the zoning variance, which pleased him in the way it always did when I engaged with his work. After dinner, he went to his office. I heard the lock click. I washed the dishes and thought about October. There is a particular kind of silence that is not emptiness. It is the silence of someone who has decided, who has looked at the full shape of a situation, turned it over, held it to the light, traced every edge, and arrived at a course of action so clear and so complete that there is nothing left to say out loud. It is the silence of a woman who has stopped grieving and started working. That was the silence I carried through May and June and most of July. Dominic did not notice. This did not surprise me. He had spent 9 years reading my stillness as contentment. He had no reason to revise that interpretation now. As far as he was concerned, I was exactly what I had always appeared to be, a private, self-contained woman who asked few questions and caused no disruption. A wife who painted in the second bedroom and did quiet consulting work for people he had never met. He had no idea that the consulting work had just become the most important project of my professional life. The first call I made was to Marcus the morning after I found the contract. I have already told you that. What I have not told you is what Marcus said when I finally explained everything: the contract, the empty studio, the owner consent line. Left blank the October date. There was a silence on his end that lasted long enough for me to count to 7. Then he said, "Tell me what you need." That was Marcus Webb in 4 words. In 12 years of working together, first as colleagues at a gallery in Midtown, then as partners in everything VNL had become, I'd never heard him say anything more complicated than that in a moment of crisis. Tell me what you need. It was the most useful sentence in the English language deployed by the right person at the right time. What I needed was a buyer list. What I needed after that was a plan. We met in person the following Thursday at a coffee shop on Auburn Avenue that neither of us had visited before, a precaution that felt necessary in a way I could not fully articulate but did not question. I brought the photographed pages of the contract. Marcus brought a printed spreadsheet of our full buyer registry, 214 individuals across 19 states, representing a combined acquisition budget that I knew from our records exceeded $40 million annually. We spread the documents across a corner table and worked for 3 hours. The mean street space held a maximum of 90 guests in its auction configuration. Harmon and Associates' standard practice, according to their website, and 2 phone calls Marcus made posing as a potential consignor, was to issue personal invitations to pre-approved collectors and close the list at 80. There would be a small staff presence, a house auctioneer, 2 bid assistants, a registration desk, 80 paddles, 80 people who would determine what happened to 14 years of my life. I needed enough of those 80 to be mine, not a majority, not even close to all of them. What I needed was a distributed presence, enough buyers seeded through the room that no single cluster of genuine outside collectors could drive a competing block of bids. What I needed was control of the floor without the appearance of control. Invisible architecture. The thing I'd been building for 12 years. Marcus identified 31 names from our registry who met 3 criteria. They were Atlanta-based or regularly attended Atlanta events. They had acquisition budgets in the range appropriate for works priced between $75,000 and $340,000, and they were discreet enough to participate in what I was about to ask them to do without telling anyone they were doing it. 31 people who would receive a call from me. Not from VNL, not from Marcus. From me personally explaining that I needed a favor of a particular kind, and that I would explain the full context when the time was right, and that I was asking them to trust me the way I had trusted them over the years with things that mattered. 29 said yes, without asking for more detail. One asked a single question, "Is this legal?" to which I said yes, and they said fine. One said they needed a week to check their schedule, and then called back in 4 days to confirm. 31 buyers, 31 paddles, in a room of 80. I spent June and July managing the logistics with the same precision I had applied to every VNL acquisition for the past decade. Coordinating attendance confirmations, briefing each buyer individually on the works they would be bidding on, not from photographs, because I was not willing to give Dominic any reason to suspect the studio visits had not gone unnoticed, but from memory. I described each canvas from the inside out, the scale, the palette, the internal logic of the composition. I knew them well enough to reconstruct them in language so specific that Marcus told me afterward he felt he had seen them without ever having been in my studio. I also during this period did something I had been considering for longer than the contract had existed. I called our family attorney. Her name was Patricia Osei, and she had been practicing family and estate law in Atlanta for 27 years. She was thorough, unimpressed by drama, and had the particular quality of stillness that I recognized in myself, the stillness of someone who has seen enough that very little surprises them anymore. I sat in her office on a Wednesday afternoon in late June, and I told her everything. The parking receipt, the transfers, the contract, the blank consent line. Patricia listened without interrupting. When I finished, she opened a drawer and removed a folder that she set on the desk between us, without opening it. "Before you came in today," she said, "I pulled your prenuptial agreement and your current joint asset documentation." I had a feeling this conversation was coming. She opened the folder. She turned it to face me and pointed to a clause near the bottom of page 3. It was a clause I had insisted on including 9 years ago at the advice of an older artist friend who had told me to always protect the work before you protect anything else. Dominic had signed it on the same morning we signed everything else, in the same backward slant without reading it carefully. The clause specified that all creative works produced during the marriage remained the sole intellectual and physical property of the creator, and that any sale or transfer of said works required the written notarized consent of the creator prior to the transaction. Dominic had not obtained my consent. He had not obtained my consent, which meant the contract with Harmon and Associates was legally invalid, which meant the auction itself was conducted on fraudulent grounds, which meant that every dollar generated by those sales would be subject to legal recovery. Patricia let me sit with that for a moment. Then she said, "There's something else." She turned to a second page in the folder. A document I'd not seen before, a summary of joint asset filings Dominic had made over the past 2 years, cross-referenced against VNL Privates Incorporation documents. Buried inside a business filing from 2018 that Dominic had asked me to co-sign during a period when we were restructuring our household finances, there was a clause that had gone unnoticed by both of us. It made me a passive co-owner of Dominic Hale Properties LLC, not a controlling interest, but a documented stake. 12%. Enough. Patricia looked at me across the desk. "He filed it himself," she said. "His accountant recommended it for tax purposes. I don't think he ever read what he was signing." I thought about the October auction. I thought about 31 buyers in a room of 80. I thought about the ochre line on the burgundy canvas and the way Dominic used to stand in the studio doorway and call it my universe, and the morning he left for work smelling of someone else's choices. "Get everything ready," I told Patricia. "All of it." She nodded and wrote one word at the top of her notepad: October. I learned about Sienna on a Thursday afternoon in August from a woman named Claudette Reeves. Claudette was a residential real estate broker. Sharp, well-connected, the kind of woman who knew the inventory of every luxury building in Atlanta, the way a librarian knows the shelves. She had purchased 2 works through VNL 3 years earlier and had since become one of our quieter but more reliable collectors. We had lunch occasionally. She was not a close friend, but she was the kind of person who noticed things, and when the occasion warranted, said them. We were at a restaurant on Peachtree Street, splitting a chopped salad and talking about a Ghanaian sculptor whose work I had been tracking when Claudette set down her fork, and looked at me with the particular expression of someone who has been deciding whether to say something for the entire length of a meal. "I'm going to tell you something," she said, "and I want you to know I almost didn't." "Tell me," I said. "I showed a unit last week," she said. 18th floor Midtown high-rise on Crescent Avenue. Gorgeous views. The buyer was a young woman, late 20s, very pretty, very certain of what she wanted. She had a man with her who did most of the talking. Claudette paused. The man was Dominic. I held my water glass and said nothing. "He introduced her as a friend he was helping find a place," Claudette said. But Valentina, the way he stood next to her, the way he put his hand on the small of her back when she walked to the window. She shook her head. "That's not how you stand next to a friend." "Did she sign anything?" I asked. Claudette looked at me carefully. "A letter of intent. He paid the holding deposit. Cash transfer same day. I did the arithmetic in my head. The $800 in March. The $1, $200 in April. Smaller transfers in May and June that I had documented but not yet traced to a destination. A holding deposit on an 18th floor unit on Crescent Avenue would have required significantly more than that, which meant there was money moving that I had not yet found." "What was her name?" I asked. "The listing had her as Sienna Marsh," Claudette said. I repeated the name once internally and stored it. "Thank you for telling me," I said. "Are you all right?" "I'm fine," I said. And then, because Claudette was a person who deserved more than a reflexive answer, I will be. We finished lunch. I paid. I walked to my car on a Thursday afternoon in August with Sienna Marsh's name in my mouth and the specific image of Dominic's hand on the small of her back at a window with a midtown view, and I sat in the driver's seat for a while without starting the engine. Here is what I did not do. I did not call Dominic. I did not drive to Crescent Avenue. I did not open the tracking application on my phone that Patricia's investigator had helped me install 3 weeks earlier, though I was aware that it would have told me exactly where Dominic was at that moment. What I did was call Marcus. "The buyer registry," I said when he answered. "Cross-reference it with any connections to residential properties on Crescent Avenue, Midtown. I'm looking for anything tied to a unit on the 18th floor. Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Give me an hour." He called back in 40 minutes. The building on Crescent Avenue, a 40-story glass tower called The Meridian, completed in 2020, had 3 VNL-connected entities with ownership stakes in its commercial podium floors. One of them, a hospitality investment group whose principal had purchased 4 works through us over the past 2 years, held a 15% interest in the building's property management company, which meant that when Sienna Marsh's lease was finalized, the management company that processed her application would be doing so with an entity that answered at least in part to a network I was embedded in. I did not plan this. I want to be clear about that. I had not set out to build leverage over every corner of Dominic's life. I had simply spent 12 years building relationships in a city that turned out to be smaller than it appeared from the outside, and now those relationships were arranged around me, like a net I had not known I was weaving. Marcus understood this before I said it out loud. "You already own part of the building she's moving into," he said. "Not directly," I said. "Close enough," he said. I drove home. I made dinner. I set the table for two and opened a bottle of wine and waited for Dominic to come home from wherever he had been, and when he walked in at 7:40 with a story about a site visit in Sandy Springs that had run long, I handed him a glass and listened to the story with the full quality of my attention. He was a good liar. I had not known that about him until recently, and now I could not unknow it. The specific fluency of it, the detail, the timing, the way he made eye contact at exactly the right moments, told me this was not new. He had practiced this, possibly for longer than I had been tracking. That thought arrived with a coldness I did not try to warm. After dinner, he mentioned almost as an aside that he had been speaking with an old colleague about some investment opportunities and might need to move some funds around over the next few months. He used the word illiquid in a way that was meant to sound technical and incidentally discourage follow-up questions. He had used this word with me before in financial conversations. It had always worked. "Of course," I said. "Whatever you need." He visibly relaxed. The micro-expression, a slight release across the forehead, a fractional drop of the shoulders lasted less than a second. I cataloged it and said nothing. 3 days later, Marcus forwarded me a message from an industry contact in Atlanta's auction circuit. Harmon and Associates had begun issuing invitations for a private sale event on the 3rd Tuesday of October. The consignment included 14 works of mixed and oil media by an unnamed artist, estimated in the range of $75,000 to $95,000 per work. The invitations described the collection as sourced from a private Atlanta estate, my life's work reduced to an estate sale. I read the forwarded message twice. I poured myself a glass of water. I stood at the kitchen window and looked out at the city, the lights of Buckhead stacking up against the dark, the specific amber glow of a place that had always felt like mine. Then I called Claudette Reeves. "I need a favor," I said, "and I need you to tell no one." "Done," she said, before I had finished the sentence. "The building on Crescent Avenue," I said. "The Meridian. When Sienna Marsh's lease paperwork goes through the management company, I need to know." Claudette was quiet for exactly 1 second. "You're not going to do anything to her, are you?" "No," I said. And I meant it. Sienna Marsh was 29 years old and had been handed a story about a man that I suspected contained very little truth. What happened to her as a consequence of Dominic's choices was not something I intended to direct. "This isn't about her." "All right," Claudette said. The lease was finalized on a Friday in early September. The holding deposit, $18,000, transferred in 2 installments, traced back to an account that Marcus identified within 48 hours as a subsidiary of one of Dominic's smaller LLCs, a shell entity he had established in 2020 that did not appear in any of our joint filings. Patricia added it to the folder. The folder was getting thick. In the 2nd week of September, Marcus and I finalized the buyer coordination. 31 confirmed attendees. Paddle allocations reviewed. Bidding parameters discussed individually with each buyer, not fixed prices, but understood ranges, the kind of soft coordination that falls well within the legal boundaries of private sale participation. Each person understood that they were helping me recover my own work. Each person understood that the proceeds would be complex. Each person trusted me enough not to need the full picture in advance. On the Sunday before the auction, I drove alone to the Mean Street warehouse and sat in my car across the street and looked at the building for 20 minutes. A converted industrial space with tall arched windows and a loading bay converted to a side entrance. The kind of place that looked like nothing from the outside and everything from the inside, which I thought was a description that applied to several things in my life. I thought about the 14 canvases inside, leaning against walls in a back room waiting to be hung for Tuesday. I thought about the ochre line on the burgundy canvas, the one I had painted at 4 in the morning, the night I found the parking receipt, the one that had become the most expensive work in the consignment, without Dominic knowing what it cost me to make it. I thought about Dominic sitting in a VIP chair in 2 days, watching numbers climb, believing he had turned my silence into money. I started the car and drove home. Tuesday was 2 days away. I had never been more ready for anything in my life. The third Tuesday of October arrived the way significant days always do, quietly, without announcement, dressed like any other morning. I woke at 5:43 before my alarm. The apartment was dark. Beside me, Dominic was still asleep, his breathing the slow, untroubled rhythm of a man who had no reason to believe today was different from any other Tuesday. I lay still for a moment and listened to it. Then I got up, went to the kitchen and made coffee. I stood at the kitchen window with my cup and watched the city come into its morning light. Atlanta in October has a particular quality of air cooler than the months before it, with a dryness that makes the light sharper, more precise. The buildings across the way caught the early sun in a way that made them look temporary, like stage sets, like things that could be struck and carried off between one scene and the next. I showered. I dressed carefully, not formally, not in anything that announced itself. Dark trousers, a cashmere turtleneck, and a deep charcoal that I had owned for 6 years, flat boots. The crescent scar beneath my left collarbone was hidden. My hair was pinned in a low coil at the base of my neck. I looked like a woman going to a meeting of moderate importance. I looked like a woman with nothing particular on her mind. Dominic stirred when I came back into the bedroom to get my coat. "Early morning," he said without fully opening his eyes. "Call with a collector in London," I said. "Go back to sleep." He did. I took my coat from the closet, checked both pockets, Patricia's summary document folded once in the left, my phone in the right, and left the apartment at 6:15. I did not go to the warehouse on Mean Street. Not yet. I went instead to a coffee shop on Ralph McGill Boulevard that Marcus and I had used as a meeting point throughout the summer. And I sat at the same corner table and waited for him. He arrived at 6:42 with 2 additional cups he didn't need and a leather portfolio under his arm, which was how I knew he had been up most of the night. "Everyone confirmed?" I asked. "As of 11 p.m. last night, yes," he said. 31. I did a final check-in round at 9. No withdrawals. "Paddle assignments." He opened the portfolio. Inside was a single printed sheet, a grid showing each of our 31 buyers, their seat assignment, as cross-referenced against the Harmon and Associates floor plan Marcus had obtained through the registration process, and a column of initials indicating which works each buyer had been briefed on. The distribution was clean, our people spread across the room in a pattern that looked from above like ordinary attendee placement, and would read from the inside as the natural behavior of independent collectors who happened to share certain tastes. We had not fixed any bids. We had not coordinated prices. What we had done was ensure that every time a lot opened, there were multiple VNL-connected paddles already warm. "Anything from Harmon's side?" I asked. "Registration closed yesterday at 4 p.m., Marcus said. "Final count is 78 invitees. Confirmed attendees as of last night, 64. 64 people in a room. 31 of them mine, just under half the room. Distributed across the full seating area, mixed into the genuine outside collectors Harmon had sourced independently. Not enough to guarantee any single outcome. More than enough to shape the whole." Marcus slid the sheet across the table. I looked at it for a moment and then slid it back. "Burn it after," I said. He nodded. He put it back in the portfolio. He picked up one of the unnecessary coffee cups and looked at me with the steadiness that had always been the most reliable thing about him. "How are you?" he asked. It was a real question. I gave it a real answer. "I'm good," I said. "I'm actually good." He nodded again. He believed me, which meant it was probably true. We reviewed the final logistics for 40 minutes. I reviewed Patricia's timeline. The documents she had prepared would be ready for delivery at a specific point in the evening, coordinated with the close of the auction. The investigator Patricia had retained had confirmed through sources I did not ask him to name that Dominic would be in the front VIP section for the duration of the sale. Sienna Marsh would not be present. Dominic had apparently told her the auction was a private business event, which, in a sense I doubted he had intended, was entirely accurate. At 8:15, I walked to my car and drove to Mean Street. I did not go inside. I parked across the street and watched the building for 20 minutes, the warehouse with the arched windows, the side entrance where a Harmon staff member in a dark blazer was already stationed a catering van, unloading at the loading bay. Somewhere inside, my 14 canvases were being hung on temporary walls under lighting that someone else had chosen. I thought about the night I had painted the ochre line. 4 in the morning, the apartment silent, the parking receipt folded in my coat pocket. The sensation of the brush in my hand, the specific physical certainty of making a mark on the surface and having it mean exactly what you intended. I had not known when I made that line that it would become the final work in the consignment. The last lot of the evening, the one that closed at $340,000 to a paddle. Held by a woman named Constance Aurelius, who had been buying through VNL for 7 years and who had when I called her in June. Listened to everything I said, and then asked only one question. "Is the painting worth it?" "Yes," I said. "Then I'll be there," she said. I started my car and drove back to Buckhead. The auction began at 7 p.m. I knew this because I had the printed schedule that Harmon and Associates had included in the formal invitation, an invitation that had arrived without irony at our home address addressed to Dominic Hale and guest. He had RSVP'd for one. I spent the afternoon at home. I answered emails. I reviewed 2 acquisition proposals that Marcus had forwarded. I made a simple dinner that I did not eat. At 6 p.m., Dominic emerged from his office in a dark suit and a tie I had given him 2 years ago for his birthday charcoal silk, which I had chosen because it made him look authoritative and told me he had a client event that would run late. "Don't wait up," he said. "I won't," I said. He left at 6:15, 45 minutes before the auction began. I waited until I heard the elevator close. Then I put on my coat, checked both pockets, and left 11 minutes after him. I did not go inside the warehouse. This was the part of the plan that Marcus had questioned most. He had wanted me in the room in a back corner watching. I had said no. I did not need to watch it happen. What I needed was to be present for the end. So I stood on the sidewalk across the street from the Mean Street warehouse on a Tuesday night in October in flat shoes and a coat I had owned since 2019, and I listened. Through the tall glass doors, muffled but audible, the rhythm of an auction in motion, the auctioneer's cadence, the low murmur of a room, concentrating the occasional rise in energy when a bid climbed past its expected ceiling. I had been to enough auctions in my professional life to read the room by sound alone. What I heard in the spaces between the formal call and response was a room being guided. My phone was in my right coat pocket. At 7:23, it buzzed with a message from Marcus Lots 1, 3 closed. All VNL. Average 18% above estimate. At 8:04, Lot 7, the triptych, closed at $287,000. Buyer R. Okonkwo, Roland Okonkwo, a retired cardiologist from Alpharetta who had been collecting through VNL for 4 years and who had wept slightly when I described the triptych to him over the phone. In July, the one I had painted the winter my mother had her surgery, the blues and grays of those 3 weeks compressed into 3 panels of 48 inches each. He had said, "I want that one." I had said, "I know." At 9:17 final lot. Untitled number 7. Opening at $80,000. I put my phone back in my pocket. Through the glass doors, I could hear the auctioneer begin the final sequence. The opening number, the first response, the second, the acceleration that happens when a room understands it is witnessing something real. The numbers climbed in a way that was audible, even from where I stood, not in the specific figures, but in the frequency of the auctioneer's calls, the shortening intervals, the particular pitch of a room that has caught fire. Then the sound of a gavel. Then applause. My phone buzzed one final time. Marcus, $340,000. Constance, clean. I stood on the sidewalk for a moment longer. The October air was cool and dry and precise the way I had described it to myself that morning. Across the street through the glass, I could see the shapes of people beginning to move, the post-auction drift of a room releasing its tension collectors, moving toward each other, staff gathering materials. And there near the front, the broad-shouldered silhouette of a man in a charcoal suit who had just watched 14 works he did not own sell for a combined total of just over $2 million, a number so far above his estimates that I was certain even from across the street that he was already calculating what it meant for the apartment on Crescent Avenue. He had no idea that every dollar in that room was already spoken for. He had no idea that the accounting was not yet finished. He had no idea that I was standing 30 feet away on the other side of a pane of glass, in flat shoes and a coat I had owned since 2019, waiting for him to come outside. I checked my phone one more time. A message from Patricia sent at 9:22, documents ready. I'm outside. I looked up. Down the block, the headlights of a black sedan blinked twice. I buttoned my coat and walked toward the door. The door opened before I reached it. Not because anyone was waiting for me, but because two collectors were leaving still mid-conversation, their paddles tucked under their arms and their faces carrying the particular animation of people who have just spent significant money and feel justified about it. They held the door without looking at me. I walked through. The space was larger inside than the exterior suggested. Harmon and Associates had transformed the warehouse with a precision that surprised me, track lighting on adjustable arms, temporary walls, in a warm, off-white, dark hardwood flooring laid over the original concrete, a long credenza along the east wall holding champagne and sparkling water. It looked like a place where serious things were meant to happen. It had tonight been exactly that. The 14 canvases were still on the walls. I had not anticipated that. I had expected the works to be taken down between the close of the auction and the moment I arrived. Instead, they were still hanging, all 14 arranged in the sequence Harmon's team had chosen, running clockwise around the room's perimeter. Under the track lighting, at the specific warmth and angle that someone with taste had calibrated, they looked like the best work I had ever made. They were the best work I had ever made. I stood just inside the entrance for a moment and looked at them. Not at all of them, just at the one directly across the room. The large burgundy canvas with the ochre line. Untitled number 7. Constance Aurelius was standing in front of it with a glass of champagne, looking up at the horizontal line of ochre, the way I had hoped someone would look at it one day. She saw me across the room. She raised her glass, barely a gesture so small it was invisible to anyone not watching for it. I raised mine, though I was not holding one. Valentina. Dominic's voice behind me and to the left. I turned. He was standing 6 feet away, champagne in hand, his expression arranged into the specific configuration of controlled surprise eyebrows, slightly raised mouth, in the early stages of a smile. Eyes doing the rapid calibration of a man trying to determine what the situation required of him. He was very good at this. He had always been very good at this. "You came," he said. The smile resolved. I didn't know you were. I thought you had the London call. It ended early, I said. I watched him process this. I watched the champagne glass shift in his hand, not by much, but by enough. A small redistribution of weight, the kind you make when you need something to do with your hands. You look beautiful, he said, which was what he always said when he did not know what else to say. Thank you, I said. It went well tonight. It really did. The confidence resettled in his posture, familiar territory numbers he could speak to. I have to say, I wasn't sure about the estimates, but the room was strong. Really strong. There's one at the back, the big burgundy one. It closed at $340. 340,000, I said. Wild right. He shook his head with the particular wonder of a man who believes he has just discovered a gold mine he found in someone else's land. The market for this kind of work right now is... Dominic, I said. Something in the way I said his name made him stop. I had not raised my voice. I had not changed my expression. I had simply said his name with the full weight of everything I knew, and the sound of it landed in the space between us like a stone dropped into still water. I know about the contract, I said. His face did not collapse. He was too controlled for that. What happened was smaller and more revealing. A fractional tightening around the eyes, a barely perceptible stillness in the jaw. The champagne glass rising a half-inch toward his mouth and then stopping. Valentina. I know about Sienna, I said. Now the jaw did tighten. The champagne glass lowered. I know about the account, I said. The LLC you established in 2020. The holding deposit on Crescent Avenue. The $18,000 in 2 installments. I paused. I know about the owner consent line you left blank. Around us, the room continued its post-auction drift collectors, talking staff moving the warm, ambient noise of a space winding down. No one was watching us. We were 2 people having a quiet conversation near the entrance of a private event, which was on the surface exactly what we appeared to be. You should understand something, I said. I reached into my left coat pocket and removed Patricia's document, folded once as I had placed it that morning. I held it out to him. He did not take it immediately. I waited until he did. Page 1 is the prenuptial clause, I said. The one specifying that all creative works produced during the marriage require my written notarized consent before any sale or transfer. You didn't get my consent, Dominic, which means the contract you signed with Harmon and Associates is not valid, which means the sales that close tonight are subject to legal recovery. He opened the document. His eyes moved across the page, with the specific quality of a man reading something he is hoping will say something other than what it says. Page 2, I said, is the joint asset filing from 2018. The one your accountant recommended for tax purposes. The one that gives me a 12% stake in Dominic Hale Properties, LLC. He turned to page 2. His expression did not change, but his breathing did a slight shallowing, barely visible, the kind of physiological response that precedes a decision. Page 3, I said, is the divorce petition. Patricia filed it this afternoon at 4:15. You'll receive formal service in the morning, but I wanted you to have the courtesy of knowing tonight. He looked up from the document. For the first time in 9 years of marriage, I saw Dominic Hale look at me and not know what to do. It lasted several seconds. Around us, the room continued its motion, champagne glasses, low conversation, the sound of someone's heels crossing the hardwood floor near the credenza. Through the window, I could see the street outside, the headlights of Patricia's black sedan, still visible down the block. You planned this, he said. His voice was very quiet. You planned yours, I said. I planned mine. He looked down at the document in his hand. Then he looked up at the room he had arranged, the room he had seeded with invitations, the room where he had believed he was turning my silence into money. "Who are these people?" he said, not loudly, almost to himself. "Collectors," I said. "They've been buying through VNL for years." A silence. "VNL," he said. "Valentina, my initials." I watched it move across his face, the arithmetic of it, the slow resolution of something he had been too incurious to add up. "VNL Private. The consulting work I do for collectors. The clients I've never introduced you to. The mailing list, the acquisition, records the $4 million in facilitated sales over the past 6 years." I let him sit in it for a moment. "The people in this room tonight, Dominic, the ones who drove those numbers up, they weren't strangers. They were mine." He looked at the room again. Differently this time. I reached into my right coat pocket and removed a second envelope, smaller unsealed, which I placed on top of the document in his hand. "That's the accounting," I said. "Every dollar that closed tonight is documented. Because the sales were made without my consent, the proceeds are legally encumbered. Patricia will be in touch with Harmon's counsel in the morning." I paused. "You sold my work to pay for her apartment. I bought it back with interest, and now I own part of the building she lives in too." He did not say anything. "I'm not angry," I said, which was true and which I could see surprised him more than anything else I had told him. I was for a while, but anger is expensive, and I've been too busy. I buttoned the top button of my coat. "The ochre line," I said. "In the burgundy canvas. You used to stand in the doorway and look at it. You called it my universe." I glanced across the room at untitled number 7, still hanging under its track light, still holding Constance's attention. "I painted it the night I found your parking receipt. 4 in the morning. I didn't know then that it would be the last thing I made in that studio, or the most expensive thing in this room tonight." I looked back at him. But I think some part of me knew it was a goodbye. Dominic stood with the document and the envelope in his hands and said nothing. His signet ring caught the light as his grip tightened the small gold ring on his right hand that he had worn every day for the 11 years I had known him. I had never asked him where it came from. I realized I never would. "Good night, Dominic," I said. I turned and walked toward the exit. Behind me, I heard nothing. No footsteps following, no voice calling my name. Just the ambient sound of a room full of people who had come to witness something valuable, and had, without knowing it, witnessed something else entirely. Outside, the October air was cool and precise, and exactly as I had described it to myself that morning. Patricia's sedan was waiting at the curb. Marcus was standing beside it with his hands in his coat pockets, and the expression of a man who has been holding his breath for 6 months and has just been told he can stop. I walked toward them. Behind me, through the glass, Dominic was still standing exactly where I had left him, in a room full of my work, holding a document that named everything he had not read. The first thing to go was the Gwinnett County deal. I did not engineer this. I want to be precise about that. What happened in the weeks following the auction was not something I directed or accelerated. It was the natural consequence of a structure that had always been more fragile than it appeared, meeting a force it had not anticipated. I simply stepped back and let physics operate. Dominic called me 11 times between the night of the auction and the following Friday morning. I did not answer. Patricia had advised against direct communication, and I had followed her advice with the same discipline I had applied to everything else over the preceding 6 months. His texts arrived in clusters, first measured almost formal, the language of a man who believed he could still negotiate his way out of a situation if he chose the right words. Then less measured. Then by Thursday, a single message that read, "Only please," which I read once and did not respond to. On Friday morning, Patricia called me at 8:40. "Harmon's counsel contacted us last night," she said. They're not contesting the consent clause. They've acknowledged the filing. What does that mean practically? I asked, though I already knew. It means the proceeds from Tuesday's auction are legally encumbered pending resolution. Harmon will not release funds to Dominic until the matter is settled. She paused. He had already told the seller's account where to wire the money. The wire didn't go. I poured coffee and said nothing. He also, Patricia continued with the careful neutrality she maintained even when delivering information that was not neutral, attempted to access the joint account on Wednesday morning. There was a hold in place. He would have seen that when he tried. The hold was something Patricia and I had arranged 3 weeks before the auction. A precautionary freeze on joint liquid assets filed quietly through our financial institution's legal process. It had required documentation I'd spent 2 months gathering. It had been one of the least dramatic steps in the entire sequence, and it would turn out to be one of the most consequential. Dominic had built his personal liquidity around the assumption that the auction proceeds would arrive within 72 hours. The holding deposit for Crescent Avenue was already paid. The first month's rent on Sienna's apartment was scheduled for the 1st of November, 11 days away. The LLC he had used to funnel funds, the one Patricia had identified in the 2020 filings, had a balance of just over $4,000, which was not enough for what he had promised, and not enough to course-correct quickly. The Gwinnett County development deal required a capital contribution from Dominic Hale Properties within 30 days as part of a consortium agreement he had signed in August. The contribution amount was $380,000. When his partners, 2 developers from Marietta, who had worked with Dominic for 6 years, attempted to confirm the transfer timeline on the Thursday after the auction, Dominic told them he was managing a temporary cash flow issue and asked for 2 weeks. They gave him 1. They gave him 90. I learned this not from Patricia and not from Marcus, but from Claudette Reeves, who had a professional relationship with one of the Marietta developers, and called me on a Saturday morning 10 days after the auction. "I'm not calling to gossip," Claudette said, which was how she always opened a call that contained information she had not been asked to find. "I know," I said. "Dominic's partners are getting nervous," she said. "Word is the Gwinnett deal is in trouble. They can't reach him consistently. One of them told my contact he's been to the office twice this week, and Dominic wasn't there." I thanked her and hung up. That afternoon, I called Marcus. "The 12% stake in Dominic Hale Properties," I said. "What's the current valuation?" "As of last quarter's filing," Marcus said. "The firm's assets are listed at approximately $6.2 million. Your stake on paper is around $740,000. And if the Gwinnett deal falls through," a pause. "That deal represented about 30% of the firm's projected revenue for the next 18 months. If it dissolves, the valuation drops significantly, possibly below $4 million. Which means my stake drops." "Yes, which means I have a financial interest in the firm's stability," I said. "You do," Marcus said carefully. "Call Patricia," I said. "I want to understand what my rights are as a partial owner with respect to asset protection." He called Patricia. Patricia called me back within the hour. What she explained with characteristic precision was that my documented stake gave me standing to request a formal accounting of the firm's current liabilities, a standard instrument available to any minority owner facing potential asset erosion. It was not hostile. It was not aggressive. It was the kind of thing any rational investor would do when they became aware that a company they held a stake in was under financial stress. We filed the request on a Monday. Dominic received it Tuesday morning. Marcus heard from a mutual contact in Atlanta's commercial real estate circuit that Dominic had been seen at a coffee shop on Peachtree Street that Tuesday afternoon, alone with his phone face down on the table and the expression of a man doing arithmetic he did not like the result of. He had ordered a coffee and not drunk it. He had been there for 2 hours, The Gwinnett partners withdrew from the consortium on the following Thursday. The capital contribution deadline had passed. They issued a formal notice of withdrawal and began the process of identifying a replacement investor. The Gwinnett deal, which had been Dominic Hale Properties' largest active project, was gone. His office manager, a woman named Patrice, who had worked for Dominic for 8 years, and who had always been politely warm to me at company events, called me on a Friday in the 3rd week of October, 2 weeks after the auction. She had my number from holiday card mailings. "Mrs. Hale," she said, and then stopped. "Valentina," I said. "Valentina," she said. "I don't know if I should be calling you. But I've been with this firm for 8 years, and I have 2 people on my team, and I wanted to know if everything is going to be all right." I sat with that for a moment. "Patrice," I said, "I want you to know that whatever happens with the firm has nothing to do with you or your team. I will make sure Patricia has your names on file." She was quiet for a second. "Thank you," she said. Then, "He's not doing well." I did not ask her to elaborate. It was not a detail I needed, and it was not something I wanted to use. Dominic's internal condition was his own, the consequence of choices that were entirely his and entirely known to him. I had not caused his distress. He had arranged for it himself over months and years with a precision that rivaled my own, only aimed in a different direction. But I will tell you what Claudette told me the following week, because it matters to understanding the full shape of what happened. Sienna Marsh had not renewed her letter of intent on the Crescent Avenue apartment. Claudette, through the management contact at the Meridian, learned that Sienna had submitted a formal withdrawal of interest on the 28th of October, 8 days after the auction, 17 days before the November 1st rent date. The reason listed on the withdrawal form was personal circumstances. The holding deposit was non-refundable. I thought about what Sienna Marsh had been told, about who Dominic was, about what he could provide, about the version of himself he had presented to a 29-year-old woman in a high-rise apartment on a Thursday afternoon in August, while a real estate broker stood across the room, and committed the scene to memory. I thought about the gap between that version and the one currently sitting alone in a coffee shop on Peachtree Street with an undrunk coffee and a phone face down on the table. I did not feel satisfaction about Sienna. I felt something closer to recognition, the specific recognition of a woman who has been handed a story that turned out to be constructed from someone else's need rather than any particular truth. I hoped she landed somewhere solid. I did not know if she would. What I knew was this. The accounting request had revealed liabilities in Dominic Hale Properties, that the quarterly filings had not fully disclosed 3 outstanding loan obligations against commercial properties, a deferred tax liability from 2022, and a line of credit drawn to 68% of its ceiling. The firm was not insolvent, but it was leveraged in a way that required consistent revenue to sustain. And consistent revenue required the kind of professional relationships that were, as of the 3rd week of October, beginning to ask questions Dominic could not answer. His largest remaining client, a hospitality group that had retained him for 3 consecutive development projects, sent a formal letter requesting a status meeting. The letter was CC'd to their legal counsel. Patricia added it to the folder. The folder was very thick now. On the last Friday of October, I sat in Patricia's office for 90 minutes, reviewing the full landscape of what had accumulated. The encumbered auction proceeds, the prenuptial clause enforcement, the asset accounting request, the 12% ownership stake and its implications, the divorce petition which Dominic had not yet formally responded to, though the deadline was approaching. At the end of the meeting, Patricia closed the folder and looked at me. "He's going to have to respond to the petition next week," she said. "When he does, his attorney will want to negotiate." "I know," I said. "What do you want?" she asked. It was the question I had been carrying for 6 months underneath everything else underneath the buyer lists and the accounting documents, and the October night on the sidewalk. What did I want when the mechanics of consequence had finished their work, and the room had gone quiet, and there was nothing left to arrange or coordinate or wait for? I looked out Patricia's window at the Atlanta skyline, the particular amber and glass of a city I had returned to at 30 years old with $40,000 and a mailing list. And a conviction that if you built something real and kept building it, eventually the structure would be strong enough to hold. "I want my work back," I said. "All 14 pieces. Legal title fully restored regardless of what the buyers paid. They knew what they were participating in. We'll make it right with each of them individually." I paused. "I want the 12% stake converted to a clean cash settlement valued at the pre-Gwinnett figure. And I want the penthouse." Patricia wrote it down without commentary. "The penthouse is in both names," she said. "I know," I said. "I picked it." She almost smiled. "Anything else?" I thought about it. "The studio," I said. "I want the room documented as mine in the settlement. Even if I don't stay in the apartment, I want it on record that it was mine." "Done," she said. She wrote it down. She looked up. "And Dominic?" I considered the question with the same care I had given everything else. "He built something real too," I said. "For a long time, he was a good man who ran a good firm. What he did to me doesn't erase that, it just ends it." I looked back at the skyline. "I don't want him destroyed. I want him out of my life. There's a difference." Patricia nodded. She understood the difference. She had been practicing long enough to know that the people who understood that difference were the ones who came out of these things intact. I put on my coat and picked up my bag. Outside, Atlanta was doing what it always did in late October, making the lights sharp and the air precise, and the city looked like a place where things that matter were being decided. They were. The divorce was finalized on a Thursday in February, 4 months after the auction. Not because the process was simple. It was not, but because Dominic's attorney, a pragmatic man named Gerald Fitch, who had been practicing family law in Atlanta for 30 years, had looked at the full weight of Patricia's documentation and advised his client with what I imagined was considerable directness, that the available paths forward were narrow and none of them were comfortable. Dominic had contested 2 items in Patricia's initial settlement proposal: the penthouse and the cash valuation of the 12% stake. Gerald Fitch had sent a counter that reduced the stake valuation by $90,000 and proposed a buyout of my interest in the penthouse rather than full transfer of title. Patricia had responded with a 47-page supplementary filing that included, among other things, a forensic accounting of the LLC transactions, the full chain of the Crescent Avenue holding deposit, and a legal analysis of the owner consent clause violation that cited 4 Georgia precedents. Gerald Fitch withdrew both counterproposals within 10 days. The settlement gave me the 14 canvases fully restored to my legal ownership, with documentation filed through Harmon and Associates, acknowledging the original contract's invalidity. It gave me the penthouse. It gave me a cash settlement of $718,000, representing the pre-Gwinnett valuation of my 12% stake, structured as a lump sum payable within 60 days of the finalization date. It gave me the studio documented in the settlement record as my creative workspace for the duration of the marriage, a detail that had no particular legal weight, but that I had asked for and Patricia had secured. It gave Dominic his firm, what remained of it, and his name on the door. I signed the final documents on a Thursday morning in Patricia's office, in the same chair where I had sat 6 months earlier and told her everything. She witnessed my signature. Her assistant notarized it. Outside the window, Atlanta was in the early stages of its February thaw, the specific gray-gold light of a city deciding to become spring. I shook Patricia's hand. I thanked her. I walked to my car and sat in the parking structure for several minutes without starting the engine, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I wanted to be still for a moment before the next thing began. My phone buzzed. "Marcus, it's done. It's done," I wrote back. 3 dots appeared, then dinner. "Tonight. I'm picking the place." I drove home. The news moved through Atlanta's professional community the way news always moves in a city of that size, faster than you expect and more accurately than you hope. I had not spoken publicly about any of it. Patricia had not issued any statements. Marcus had maintained the discretion that was the foundation of everything we did at VNL. What spread was not the full story. It was never the full story, but enough of it that the relevant people understood the outline. The first call I did not expect came from Roland Okonkwo, the retired cardiologist from Alpharetta, who had purchased the triptych at the auction for $287,000. "I want you to know," he said when I answered, "that I consider the purchase entirely complete. The triptych is mine, and I'm keeping it." "Roland," I said, "the legal position requires—" "I know what the legal position requires," he said. "I'm telling you what my position is. I bought it because I wanted it, and because you asked me to be there, and those are both still true. Work out whatever you need to work out legally and send me whatever documents you need me to sign, but I'm not giving it back." I sat with that for a moment. "The 3 panels," I said. "The blues and grays." "I hung them last week," he said. "In my reading room. I sit with them every morning." I thought about the winter of my mother's surgery, the way those weeks had compressed into something I could only process through color and dimension, the specific quality of gray that was not grief, but something adjacent to it. The gray of a waiting room, at 2 a.m, of fluorescent light on linoleum of a city seen through a hospital window at a height where everything familiar looks temporary. "Keep them," I said. "I'll send the documents." He was not the only one who called. Constance Aurelius, who had closed on untitled number 7 at $340,000, sent a formal letter through her attorney proposing a long-term loan arrangement. She would retain physical custody of the painting, while legal title remained with me, with a right of first refusal should I ever choose to sell. Her attorney's letter was 3 pages. The proposal itself was contained in 1 paragraph at the end. It was the most elegant solution to a complex problem I had encountered in the entire proceeding, and I accepted it within 48 hours. Of the 31 buyers who had participated in the auction, 26 chose to retain their works under negotiated arrangements rather than return them. The remaining 5 returned their pieces cleanly and without complaint in 2 cases, because they had purchased them as investments rather than for personal meaning, and in 3 cases, because they were, as one of them told Marcus directly, just glad to be useful. All 14 canvases were legally restored to my ownership. 12 remained in other people's hands by mutual agreement. 2 came back to me physically, a small cadmium yellow square that I had always privately considered my best work, and a large horizontal piece in deep indigo that I had made in the first winter of our marriage and that I had not looked at in 3 years. I set them both against the north wall of the studio and looked at them for a long time. Dominic Hale Properties did not collapse. I had not wanted it to, and it did not. What happened instead was a contraction, the kind that follows overextension and is in the long run probably healthier than the alternative. The Gwinnett deal was gone. 2 smaller clients had quietly redirected their business to other firms during the period of uncertainty. The line of credit was renegotiated at a higher rate. Gerald Fitch's billing, combined with the cash settlement to me, had reduced the firm's liquid position significantly, but the fundamentals were intact. The office on Buckhead still had Dominic's name on the door. Patrice and her 2 team members were still employed, which I had verified through a channel I did not examine too closely. The hospitality group that had requested a status meeting had after that meeting renewed their engagement at a reduced scope rather than terminating it. Dominic was rebuilding. More carefully, I imagined, than before. I did not track it beyond what arrived through professional channels. I did not wish him harm. I did not wish him well in any active sense. What I felt when I thought about him at all was the specific neutrality that follows the completion of something difficult, not forgiveness, exactly, which implies an ongoing relationship with the offense, but a kind of release from it. He had become someone I had once known well, and now thought about rarely. This felt after 9 years like a remarkable amount of space. The call from New York came on a Tuesday in early March. The gallery was called Meridian House. Not the building on Crescent Avenue, a different Meridian entirely. And it was located on West 22nd Street in Chelsea, where it had operated for 14 years as one of the more respected mid-size galleries in the city's contemporary art market. The director's name was Camille Arnaud, and she introduced herself with the specific efficiency of someone who calls a lot of people and respects their time. "We've been aware of VNL Private for approximately 3 years," she said. "We've been trying to identify the person behind it for 2. "You found me," I said. "We found you," she said. "I'll be direct. We're interested in a curatorial partnership. We have the space and the market access. You have the eye and the relationships. We think there's something worth discussing." I had received variations of this call before, less direct, less well-researched, from galleries that wanted to attach the VNL name to their programming without understanding what VNL was or why it worked. I had declined all of them. Camille Arnaud had done her research. She knew the artists I had championed before the market caught up with them. She knew the collectors I had cultivated. She knew somehow that I had recently navigated a situation of personal complexity and had emerged from it with my collection intact and my professional standing undiminished. "How did you hear about us?" I asked. "Marcus Webb spoke at a symposium in October," she said. "Someone in the audience forwarded me the recording." A pause. He described VNL's acquisition philosophy in a way I found clarifying. I smiled at nothing in particular. "Send me a proposal," I said. "I'll look at it." She sent it within 24 hours. It was 31 pages, well organized and serious in all the ways that mattered. I read it twice and forwarded it to Marcus with a single note. "What do you think?" He called me back in an hour. "I think it's what we've been building toward," he said, without knowing we were building toward it. We scheduled a call with Camille Arnaud for the following week. The call lasted 2 hours and covered ground I had not expected, not just the curatorial partnership, but the possibility of VNL mounting its first fully attributed exhibition. Named. My name. Valentina Webb on a wall in Chelsea, attached to 14 years of curatorial work that had always existed in a register the public had never seen. The exhibition was not scheduled for the autumn. It would take time. It would take the kind of careful, deliberate construction that everything worth doing requires. But after the call, when I sat in the studio with the 2 canvases against the north wall and the northeast window, throwing its best morning light across the floor, it felt less like a possibility and more like a direction. A thing I was moving toward rather than a thing I was moving away from. Marcus took me to dinner that Thursday, as promised, at a restaurant on Ponce de Leon Avenue that I had walked past 100 times and never entered. We sat at a corner table and ordered things I do not usually order and talked about everything and nothing with the ease of 2 people who have been through something significant together and arrived somewhere better than where they started. At some point he said, "Do you ever think about how differently it could have gone?" I considered it honestly. "No," I said. "Not really." He looked at me. "I think the plan was always there," I said. "He just gave me a reason to use it." Marcus raised his glass. I raised mine. Outside the window, Ponce de Leon Avenue moved through a Thursday evening in February, with the ordinary motion of a city that does not stop for anyone's private reckoning The traffic, the pedestrians, the particular warmth of streetlights, on a night that was almost but not yet spring. I thought about a parking receipt. The timestamp, 11:47 p.m. A Tuesday. The smallest thing in the end that had started everything. The exhibition opened on a Friday evening in October, exactly 1 year after the auction. I did not plan the timing deliberately. It arrived that way because the work required what it required. The curation, the installation design, the negotiations with Camille Arnaud's team about sequencing and lighting and the specific weight of text on the wall cards, and when everything was finally ready, the calendar said October, and I accepted that as the kind of coincidence that is not really a coincidence at all. The space was on the second floor of Meridian House, a long rectangular room with 14-foot ceilings and a row of north-facing skylights that threw the same quality of light I had spent 20 years chasing in every studio I'd ever worked in. Camille had fought for the room specifically against the preference of her programming director, who wanted the larger ground floor gallery. She had called me after winning the argument and said only, "The light is right," which was all I needed to hear. We hung 13 works, not 14, 13. Untitled number 7, the large burgundy canvas with the ochre line was not in the exhibition. It was in Constance Aurelius's possession in her home in Buckhead, on loan to its legal owner under the arrangement we had negotiated the previous February. I had considered requesting it back for the show. I had decided against it. Some things belong where they land. The 13 works were arranged not chronologically but atmospherically grouped by the internal season. Each one had come from rather than the calendar year of its making. The triptych was in the center of the long wall, rehung on Roland Okonkwo's behalf for the duration of the exhibition, with his enthusiastic blessing and a formal loan agreement that Camille's team had processed in 48 hours flat. On either side of it, the works arranged outward in a sequence that moved from the early grays of uncertainty through the deep indigo of the first marriage years and into the burgundies and ochres of the later ones. The colors of a woman paying attention, building something surviving the gap between what she was told and what she knew. The cadmium yellow square was at the far end of the room alone, on its wall. I had always considered it the best thing I had ever made. Standing in front of it the morning before the opening in the empty gallery, with the October light coming through the skylights at the precise angle that made everything in the room look considered, I understood why. It was not technically the most complex work. It was not the largest or the most immediately arresting. What it was honest in a way that required courage I had not known I had when I made it. Isse, a single color unmodulated, occupying the full surface of a 24-inch square canvas with the complete confidence of something that knows exactly what it is and requires nothing additional. I had made it in the second month of my marriage. Before the parking receipt, before the contract, before October became a word that meant two different things in the same year. I stood in front of it for a long time. Then I went to get ready for the opening. Marcus arrived at 6 with Denise and 2 members of Camille's team. And for an hour, we did the small, practical work of a space, preparing to receive people, adjusting a label that had shifted overnight, checking the lighting on the triptych's left panel, confirming the catering setup in the anteroom. Marcus handed me a glass of sparkling water and stood beside me at the entrance to the main gallery, and looked at the room with the expression of a man who has worked towards something for a long time and is allowing himself for one measured moment to register that it exists. 12 years, he said. 14, I said, if you count from Lyon. He considered this. 14, he agreed. The doors opened at 7. I had not prepared myself for what it would feel like to stand in a room in Chelsea with my name on the wall and watch people look at my work without knowing who made it. That anonymity, the specific invisibility of being present at something that had always been private, lasted perhaps 20 minutes before Camille introduced me to the first collector. And after that, the evening became what openings become, a sustained motion of conversation and introduction, and the particular energy of a room full of people who have all chosen to be in the same place because of something they believe matters. But I remember those 20 minutes. Standing near the entrance, a glass in my hand, watching a woman I had never met stop in front of the indigo canvas and stay there for a very long time. Not reading the wall card, not consulting her phone, just looking with the quality of attention you give to something that is speaking to you in a language you recognize, but were not expecting to hear in this particular room on this particular evening. I thought about the 12 years, 14, if you counted from Lyon, of building something invisible. The mailing list of 63 that had become 214. The $40, 000, that had become 4 million in facilitated sales, and a curatorial reputation that had traveled somehow from Atlanta to a symposium, to a phone call to this room. The deliberate architecture of a life kept in separate registers, each one real. None of them the full picture. I thought about Dominic standing in the doorway of the studio, calling it my universe, not asking what it meant. I thought about the note on the floor where the burgundy canvas had leaned. In storage, will explain. He never explained. I never needed him to. I thought about a Tuesday night in October, flat shoes, a coat I had owned since 2019, listening through glass doors to the sound of something being returned to me. The woman in front of the indigo canvas had not moved. I walked toward her. That one took 3 weeks, I said when I reached her. I painted it in the first winter of my marriage. I kept thinking I was finished, and then finding that I wasn't. She looked at me. She did not yet know who I was. How did you know when it was done? She asked. When I stopped being afraid of it, I said. She looked back at the canvas. That makes sense, she said quietly to no one in particular. The show ran for 6 weeks. In that time, 4 works were acquired by private collectors, not through auction, not through intermediary, but through Meridian House's standard sales process, with my name attached to each transaction for the first time in 14 years of making things. The triptych was returned to Roland Okonkwo at the close of the exhibition, with a formal certificate of exhibition loan, which he framed and hung beside the panels in his reading room. The cadmium yellow square did not sell. I had not listed it for sale. It came home with me on a Saturday morning in December, wrapped in archival paper, and I carried it up to the studio and set it against the north wall where it had lived before everything happened. It looked right there. It had always looked right there. Camille called me the following Monday. We want to talk about the next one, she said. I know, I said. Give me until spring. Take until summer, she said. Do it right. I sat in the studio after the call with a cup of tea and the northeast light moving across the floor in its particular morning way, and the cadmium yellow square against the wall, and the 2 remaining canvases that had come back to me, the indigo piece, now also returned from the exhibition, and leaning beside its counterpart. The studio was not empty anymore. Neither was I in the way I had been empty for longer than October, the specific hollowness of a woman who had been building something real inside a life that was becoming slowly, and then all at once a construction she had not chosen and could not sustain. That hollowness had a name now. It had a before and an after. It had a Tuesday night on a sidewalk, and a gavel, and a document folded once in a coat pocket, and a room full of people who answered to me. And it had this, a studio in October, light a cup of tea, a canvas the color of certainty on the north wall, and the particular silence of someone who has decided. Not the silence of waiting, the silence of beginning. I picked up a brush. I never painted to be seen. I painted to remember who I was before I let someone make me small. Before I confused a man's certainty about himself with a reason to be less certain about myself. Before I started measuring the value of what I built against whether the person sleeping beside me found it interesting enough to ask about, What I know now on the other side of everything is this: the things you build quietly are not less real for being unseen. They are in some ways more real because they exist without the distortion of other people's expectations. VNL was mine because no one knew to want a piece of it. The studio was mine because no one thought to look at what was made inside it. Even the plan, the 31 buyers, the October Tuesday, the document folded in my coat pocket, was mine because I had spent 14 years building the kind of relationships that hold when everything else is falling. You do not need to announce what you are building. You do not need permission to build it. You do not need someone to stand in the doorway and call it your universe before it counts as one. It counts. It always counted. The parking receipt was a Tuesday in February. By October, it was done. 6 months of work of patience, of the specific discipline required to continue living normally inside a situation that has already resolved itself in your mind, even though the world has not yet caught up. People ask me sometimes, not often, but sometimes, whether I'm angry. I tell them the truth I was. For approximately 4 minutes and 11 seconds in the doorway of an empty studio, listening to the silence where 14 years of my life had been. Then I put my keys down carefully on the shelf by the door, and I got to work. If you are standing in an empty room right now, if someone has taken something from you, if you are measuring the distance between what you were promised and what you have been given, if you are holding a note that says "will explain," and you know the explanation will never come, I want you to hear this. The room being empty is not the end of the story. It is the condition under which the next part begins. You already know what you are capable of. You have always known. The only question is whether the situation you are in is finally the one that asks you to use it. For me, it was October. For you, it might be today.